Hi, my name is Lieuwe Jongsma. I am Head of Public Affairs and Services at the Groningen Archives, and I'm a historian. And over the last 10 or so years, I've specialized in how Groningen was involved in transatlantic slavery. So the main way that Groningen was involved in transatlantic slavery is through the West India Company. And this company was founded in 1621, but it's important to note that it wasn't founded strictly as a slave trading company. It started off as more of a weapon of war in the 80 Years' War. So 1621 is the year where the 12-year truce with Spain ended, and they wanted to have a way to annoy the Spanish, essentially. So the West India Company was first and foremost aimed at privateering, capturing Spanish ships, and secondly also to get salt, because we used to get salt from Spain, and when you're at war with a country, that's pretty difficult. So they started getting salt from the Antilles and from even Venezuela. Later on, they also started trading in gold, and after a couple of years, they started looking at doing maybe some slave trade. But there was a lot of resistance against this, because it was also sort of a point of propaganda from the Dutch that they said, slave trade is something the Spanish do, and we are morally superior because we don't do that. That ended pretty quickly after 1629, when the Dutch captured Dutch Brazil, what later became Dutch Brazil. So a large chunk of northeastern Brazil, and this was like an up and running plantation, slave-based economy. And there the Dutch saw how convenient and how lucrative slavery can be. So after that, they started capturing other Spanish-Portuguese slave trading forts, posts on the West African coast, so they could get into the supply chain of human trafficking. And this is where really Dutch slavery kicks off. So from 1629 onward, the Dutch are in slave trade. When people think of slavery, people often think it's the story of Amsterdam or of Zeeland. They don't think of Groningen, but actually Groningen is one of 5 cities in the Netherlands that had their own chambers, their own offices of the West India Company. The offices were in Amsterdam, Zeeland, which was shared by Vlissingen and Middelburg, and there was one in South Holland and one in North Holland and one in Groningen. And actually, if you look at the investments and the number of officers and officials that were appointed, Groningen has a disproportionately large role in slavery, especially during the Brazilian period. Just as an example, the most well-known high-ranking official of Dutch Brazil was Johan Maurits van Nassau, the guy who famously built the Maurits House in The Hague. And when he left Brazil, his direct successor was a man from Groningen, Walter Schoneborg, former mayor of Groningen. But this is also exemplary of that Groningen supplied a lot of officials and military and other kind of employees for the West India Company, especially during that Brazilian period. So there's a lot of different ways in which Groningers and also the city of Groningen were involved in slavery. They were involved through investment. They were also involved in governance. For example, the city supplied a lot of the governance of the West India Company. They were sometimes, individuals were also involved through their job. So they became an employee of the West India Company, or maybe they traded in colonial wares. They traded in chocolate or sugar or tobacco or that kind of thing. So contrary to the Dutch West India Company, Groningen did not have its own chamber in the Dutch East India Company. But some people got very wealthy from the slave trade, and that was mainly employees of the Dutch East India Company. There it was much more normal to privately trade and enslave people as well. And some of these people came back to Groningen after a stint as an official for the Dutch East India Company, as some of the wealthiest people that Groningen has ever seen. People often think that a lot of the fancy houses you see along the canals in Groningen were built with money from slavery, and that isn't quite true. So my research has shown that over the entire period that Groningen was involved with the West India Company, the investments roughly equaled the benefits, so the dividends. So you can't say that Groningen as a whole got very wealthy off of slavery. Some individuals did, but Groningen as a whole didn't. The houses were built mainly with money from peat trade. So peat was excavated here in the province, and that got them a lot of money. Also, trade with the Baltic Sea was very lucrative. But still, you see that people were often most enthusiastic for colonial trade. And that is because it wasn't just about financial capital, it wasn't just about money, but it was a lot about cultural and social capital as well. It was about prestige. So even in times where the West India Company was making a net loss, a lot of people still flaunted their involvement, and a lot of people wanted to be involved with colonialism and transatlantic slavery. Right now, you're standing on the corner of the Noorderhaven and the Werfstraat. If you look across the water, you can see an old warehouse that has, in white letters, De Compagnie written on the facade. And that's already a hint that you're standing now right in the middle of an area that was heavily involved with the West India Company. Within a radius of 50-ish meters, I can show you locations that have a direct relation with the stories of transatlantic slave trade. Let me start with the spot that you're standing on right now. Across the corner is the Werfstraat, referring to the old WIC shipyard that was located here. So this is where they built ships for example, the Brazilian expedition. Farther along the street you have the Zoutstraat. The name refers to an old salt refinery that used to be in this location. As I explained, salt was one of the earliest trading goods for the West India Company, and it was also vital for long transatlantic voyages. So if you're going to cross the sea, you need to preserve your food, and that's what you need salt for. The refinery was also, after 1621, owned by the West India Company. Farther up this street, you have the Havenstraat, and on the corner of the Havenstraat, there used to be this old inn named Pernambuco, which was, of course, named after Pernambuco, a province of Dutch Brazil. And again, this is a location where the sailors, after they came back to Groningen, would go and share their stories about Dutch Brazil. Now, to finish up with this old warehouse I pointed your attention to start with, this warehouse is 19th century, so it's relatively new, but it's on the location where one of the main old West Indies warehouses used to be. So a lot of these ships, when they came to Groningen, would unload their colonial wares produced by enslaved people, and this would be stored in this warehouse. My master's thesis was about kinship networks around transatlantic slavery, so specifically about how families were involved in slavery, and it turned out that almost everyone involved from Groningen also had some sort of kinship relation to each other. But the explanation for this is that they also almost all were a member of the elite network in Groningen, and they often intermarried. There were specific families that were involved in slavery, and for example, they entered the network of the elite through slavery. One interesting example is the Woordman family. So Peter Woordman, he was not that wealthy, he was a normal German guy who came to Groningen, and he married the daughter of a grocer. And they had a grocery store near the Damse Diep, and he and his wife took over the store from his father-in-law, and he wasn't any good at this. He was terrible. He bankrupted the store within a couple of years. And for him, the West India Company was a way out. So after he bankrupted the store, he entered the service of the West India Company. He went to West Africa to become a slave trader and also the commander of these slave trading forts. He eventually rose through the ranks and became the director of Fort Elmina in Ghana. And that was the most important Dutch slave trading fort on the West African coast. And he was the longest serving director of that fort in history. He had a couple of children from his marriage here in Groningen, but he also fathered a couple of children with a Ghanese woman. It's interesting to see that these children, they all went back and forth from Groningen to Ghana. So his Ghanese children also came to Groningen to go to school, and his Groningen children went to Ghana to join the company, so to say. The interesting thing is that one of his Groningen sons later built this villa outside of the city, and he named the house Delmina. So it was named after the fort in Ghana. There you see that it was a family business, and again, they were proud of their involvement in slavery. I've really seen the attitude of Groningers towards this topic change a lot over the years. I started doing research about Groningen's involvement in slavery and colonialism in 2013. And back then, when I visited the archives or the museum, and I talked to experts in the history of Groningen about this topic, people told me, is that really a topic you want to dive into? Because there's hardly anything there. It's not the story of Groningen, it's more the story of Amsterdam. And we really found out since then that there was a lot still unknown about this subject. I'm not entirely sure why it's been so long, why it's gone under the radar, but I think it's an important topic to know because it's a vital part of our history in Groningen. If you don't know this part, there's a lot of things that are difficult to explain. Back in 2013, people thought it was a quirky subject. And then for a couple of years, people thought it was a controversial subject. And nowadays, people think it's a very logical subject to talk about. There was a period where I would get some resistance from people. Whenever I talked about it, people started getting defensive, and I hardly ever run into that anymore. So from all this, you might be under the impression that Groningen was sort of one of the most involved areas in slavery in all of Europe, but that isn't the case. It's much more that it's an example of how Europeans were involved in colonialism and slavery, that there were ties from colonialism and slavery that went throughout society to every corner of Europe. And it wasn't just the city here, it was the countryside as well, and you can find some sort of trace of colonialism anywhere you look in Europe.